Melissa. Welcome to the first of a new series. So I'm calling this Truth and Reconciliation Sessions in honor and homage to the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions that have happened in several countries where big traumatic events have happened and people realize that they need to get together and talk about them, get out their feelings, let that stew a little bit, let people be heard, and then discuss solutions for justice and how we go forward. So with that in mind, I thought, climate change is pretty depressing where we are right now, and I think I need help processing it. So welcome to 2025, everybody. And what a monumental day to be starting this series.
Right.
Welcome, Melissa.
Hello.
How are you doing this morning?
I'm doing just fine this morning. And I guess that's all I have to say. Because of the things that you're saying, I'm like, yep. This is where we get hope, though, right? It's coming together, finding community. Mm-hmm.
That's what I'm hoping for. So I met Melissa Eick on Booktube itself, on YouTube, when we were sprinting and chatting. And as you know, as digital identities, we can never really see the full person. But once you get to know a person, you realize, oh, they do this and this and this. Okay. So besides just writing and sprinting and chatting on YouTube, Melissa also has a huge background in the nonprofit sector and in fighting human trafficking and its effects. And so when I was talking about TRC in the series, she said, what about trafficking? Can we talk about this and how this relates? So why don't you give us a little bit about what you do and how you came to it?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and Margaret, the timing is very meaningful because January is Human Trafficking Awareness and Prevention Month in the United States. And it has been for, I think maybe the first year was 2012, something around there. It was President Obama that declared it for the first time ever. And so I feel like a lot of people might not immediately make the connection between climate change and human trafficking, but once we get into it, it just totally makes sense.
Yeah.
As for me, I have been working full-time in anti-trafficking efforts for almost 12 years. My story is that in 2008, I moved from Des Moines, Iowa, where I'm originally from, to Tulsa, Oklahoma, to attend law school at the University of Tulsa. And about 6 weeks in, I went to an International Law Society meeting, the first and only time during my whole law school 3 years. They were having a lunch meeting and they were showing this 30-minute MTV documentary starring Angelina Jolie about human trafficking, sex trafficking in Eastern Europe specifically. And it was one of those moments where I'm like, oh, my entire life trajectory changed in that moment. Wow. Seemingly inconsequential thing. You go eat lunch, right? We had subs from a really good local sub shop. And more than the content itself, I've gone back and watched it a few years ago. It was, what I remember is when they turned the lights on and they were like, okay, we're done. Meeting's over. And my whole sandwich was just sitting there untouched. And I come to, everyone around me is shuffling, gathering their things, the shuffling of a class ending type thing. And I just remember thinking, what did I just see? How is everybody normal right now? And then it was I'm a very big believer in we get callings on our life, right? Things that we know in our gut, in our spirit, whatever you want to call it, we're supposed to do. And from that moment on, it's I couldn't get away from it. And this was 2008, 2009. Oklahoma had not even yet passed a statute yet about human trafficking. The federal statute had just been passed in the year 2000. First comprehensive federal statute about human trafficking in history. These are very early days of anybody talking about this, and no one was really talking about, very few people talking about what happens here in the US.
Yeah.
But it's I couldn't escape it nonetheless. And so a few years later, graduate, practice law for a little bit. My heart was never really in that. Hi, Rita.
Thank you, Rita.
Good to see you. And then it was just in 2013, I was I can't handle this anymore. what is little me supposed to do about human trafficking when you see statistics like maybe on the low end estimates from like the International Labor Organization, 27 million to 40 million people who are enslaved in the world today? Okay, I'm going to do something about it, you know? And finally, it was just like such a burden on my heart that I had to take steps. And in 2016, through volunteering, I volunteered as an attorney. I helped with social media events for several different organizations here in Oklahoma, moved to Oklahoma City, and 3 months later founded Dragonfly, which was not a plan. It happened very organically. So almost 9 years ago, myself and 2 other co-founders founded this nonprofit. We've been doing trafficking survivor services for a few years already. There's a real need here. So we founded Dragonfly and just step by step started building this organization from scratch. We got the proper certification from the state of Oklahoma, oversight for victim services is what it's called. And first thing we did was we opened the state's first human trafficking crisis center model. Not a shelter. About at least half the people we serve don't need a shelter, right? And so if they don't qualify for a shelter, so men, sometimes non-binary people who've experienced labor trafficking, people under the age of 18, people who do not want a shelter setting, if there was no place that was non-residential for them to go, they'd have no access to services specialized for trafficking. So we went that route. And so now here we go, fast forward, almost 9 years later, we served over 1,000. Our small nonprofit, we're small. Like this is the grassiest of grassroots. None of us came into it with like, I got millions of dollars or even thousands of dollars to put into this. You know, we were literally building from scratch, served over 1,000 people who've experienced sex trafficking, labor trafficking, or both. All gender identities are welcome at Dragonfly, ages about 15 and up. If they're minors, you know, we work with the proper authorities, but we serve a lot of children because many of the people we serve have families. So we're serving, anywhere from little kids. The oldest person that we served was being labor trafficked, and this person was 80 years old. So there's a lot of people have kind of like a maybe like
image.
That's right. Yeah. And a lot of people, some people fall into that and a lot of people don't.
Yeah.
I can hit pause here, Margaret, because like I've said to you, I could just keep talking for the whole time.
Okay. Well, hi, Jocelyn.
Hi, Jocelyn.
Hi, Cat Paw. And hi, Elaine. Good morning.
Hello.
So one of the things you said will link me into my definitions question, which is the first legislation was in 2000. That was federal, and Oklahoma was followed in 2009 or so, 12. So when I think of what's happening, basically is that vulnerable populations, desperate folks are either agreeing or being kidnapped into a situation where they're forced to yield labor or, you know, sexual assault situations.
Okay.
That says to me like slavery. Like, isn't that the same as slavery? Didn't we have legislation against that? So would it fall under the same laws? Like, what's the transferability of those phrases, lawyer Melissa?
Yep, here we go. And I'm writing down some notes. Something I would like to address, Margaret, if we have time, are common misconceptions about human trafficking that we're talking about. We talk about literally all the time. Here in less than 2 weeks, we're going to host our 12th annual Human Trafficking Awareness Month Candlelight Vigil. And the whole theme is kind of giving some of these misconceptions people tend to have about trafficking. So let me write a note here. So prior to this federal legislation that was passed in the year 2000, there were anti-slavery statutes, and there were also like piecemeal statutes in the states that were like no forced labor. People were being taken advantage of for millennia.
Right.
People exploiting people's vulnerabilities, people exerting power, demand for let me just give a little bit disclaimer to everyone who's here, and maybe Margaret, you might want to post it. It's just occurring to me. When we're talking about human trafficking, people need to take care of themselves because while there is a lot of hope I get to see the hope every day. It can be very triggering to people with stuff that maybe related experiences, some different crimes that people inflict upon others that might not be trafficking, but can bump up against that. So just a notice to take care of yourself. And if anyone is on here and this is not uncommon and it suddenly occurs to you, oh, that's what someone did to me, but I never had a label for it. Or that's what someone did to my friend, my family member, but we never had a label for it. Just know, like, you can call the National Human Trafficking Hotline, but you can also call my nonprofit's hotline. It's a 24-hour hotline. And because we serve anybody who's ever experienced trafficking at any point in their entire life with whatever they would need in that moment. So just want to give that. Yeah. So take care of yourself, seek, just think about your mental health. Okay. So yes, there were statutes before that, Margaret, but let's get into like the definitions, like exactly what you're talking about. So the federal law delineates between sex trafficking and labor trafficking. For sex trafficking, it delineates further between adults and minors. And so like Oklahoma state law reflects these same delineations. I think, I don't know every single state's law, but similar. So for sex trafficking, something to keep in mind with sex trafficking is that it is different. It's different from sex work because there is this element in the definition where somebody is compelling someone else to do it. Versus an independent decision. So for sex trafficking, ages 18 and up, it's when someone is compelled to perform a commercial sex act through force, fraud, or coercion. A commercial sex act is a sex act in exchange for something of value with people that we have served. That could be money, it could be rent, it could be substances, all kinds of different things, but those are the three main ones. So you have sort of like this middle man. A lot of pimp controlled sex work, prostitution in the US would fall under the label of trafficking, because if someone is using force, fraud, or coercion to compel someone to do this, that's not an independent decision. Force, are you saying you have a question?
Yes, because fraud, I understand someone is duped into doing something, but force and coercion are very similar to me. So how do you separate those legally?
So force means physical force.
Okay.
That is like, I'm going to tell you right now, in the United States, at least in Oklahoma, forced kidnappings into trafficking, very rare. I mean, we work with law enforcement all across the state. We're not talking about kidnappings. Kidnappings are messy. Kidnappings are, of course, you're going to hear some story somewhere about it. It is way more effective to gain control over someone through manipulation. Let's talk about fraud, though. That is like telling someone, you want to be a model? Do you want to be an actress? Do you want to be a singer? Do you want to be a rapper? Do you want to be a dancer? Hey, I got connections. Right. Send me some nudes and I'm going to send that on to my agent friend. And they find someone who wants to get out of Oklahoma, right? Someone who wants to, have a different life. Send me some illicit photos. I'll pass it on. Now this person has control over this person. I mean, this happens so often. Now it's like, oh, well, if you don't do what I tell you to do, I'm going to share this with your family, your school. I'm going to post this all over the internet. I'm going to send it to your dad. I'm going to send it to everybody where he works. I mean, okay, so that's how fraud can often go. Coercion is gray. Coercion can look a lot of different ways. What we often see is building a relationship for the purposes of exploiting it. So reaching out to someone, becoming someone's boyfriend or girlfriend, significant other, their friend, some kind of relationship where you gain that person's trust. This person's going to make them think they love them more than anyone else, understand them better than anyone else. Let's go build a new life together. I love you. Maybe it looks like showering someone with gifts. That's a grooming process. A lot of people have heard about grooming. Okay. So then this is not a kidnapping scenario. Someone willingly may go with that person and be controlled with them. It's not a true choice because there is this already like sense of manipulation and control of the situation. The person feels like they have no other choice. Or somebody who maybe is in a vulnerable situation. Let's talk about, well, gosh, let me just get back to the definitions and then we can talk. I'm going to make a note, vulnerable situations. Let's talk about sex trafficking for people under the age of 18. It's easier to prove, right? Because we put laws in place to protect minors. Mm-hmm. So, if someone compels someone under the age of 18 to perform a commercial sex act, you don't even have to have force, fraud, or coercion present. They often are. You don't have to have a third person controlling the situation, although that can happen. If someone purchases sex from someone under the age of 18, that means that they are committing sex trafficking. Child prostitution, teen prostitution. We actually, an organization I work with, worked really hard to change that language in statutes because it's putting so much blame. It's like victim blaming, like the language that we use, we have to be careful, right? If someone's under the age of 18, we're going to protect them. Right. And so now it's more like child sex trafficking is what Oklahoma statutes say now. Great example of this. Shiny.
What are the terms that are not helpful, that are more victim blaming?
Okay, so I would say saying something like child prostitute or teen prostitute. Okay. That implies independent choice, right?
They're a small business. They're, going out and this is what they've dreamed of for 12 years. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And what we see is that the closer someone gets to the age of 18, the less compassion people have for that person. Right. Then you flip the switch and they're 18 and that compassion just goes away. So someone might have been abused their whole life, trafficked by their parents, grown up in, neglect and really hard situations that kind of created vulnerable situations for traffickers to target, but they're over the age of 18. Well, they should know better and they should be able to just get themselves out of it. Oh, okay. They no allowance for trauma. Anyway, I'm sorry, I'm getting off track.
And so, but you're bringing up another point, which is that there are a lot of things contributing to the vulnerable state, and yes. Climate change also contributes to sort of like bring it back into the nexus. We have
let me get
lots
into
of issues.
So I have it written down. Let me talk about labor trafficking because that's going to be a big one for this conversation. So in federal law in the U.S. defines labor trafficking as compelling someone to perform services of some kind, regardless of their age, through force, fraud, or coercion. So some really common examples include industries, agriculture, construction, hotel, restaurant, domestic servitude, people serving, cleaning someone's home, for example. Got all kinds of examples of that happening like just here in Oklahoma. And then indentured servitude, debt bondage. It's a really important concept to know in all of this. So let's say, for example, so at Dragonfly, we serve anyone regardless of their immigration status, right? You get people who are brought to the U.S. Very often on a legal work visa. They think that they're coming here to do like a specialized job or some specific job, and they're going to send money back. They're recruited through flashy recruiters. They think that this is legitimate and the opportunity of a lifetime. And then they arrive here and the trafficker, to get free or cheap labor, because there is so much demand for free or cheap labor, the trafficker purposely violates the terms of the visa. Now they have total control over that person. Right. Through immigration. It's called abusing the legal system. Right. And so let's go ahead and move on because I think that the labor trafficking aspect will probably come up more in our discussion.
Okay. So we've got a lot of different strands here, but to sort of try to center the discussion, we've got human trafficking And we've got it on the local level with Dragonfly, Melissa's organization in Oklahoma, which we have experience that she can talk about. We also have global effects because globally, human trafficking is an issue, and we've got, case studies, reports, white papers, governments doing less or better jobs at combating it. But basically, in each case, it's a question of vulnerable populations resorting to human trafficking as a survival tactic. I think in one of the documents you sent me, it was like adverse coping strategy, and I went, oh my God, UN speak. Okay, adverse coping strategy. Let's go with that.
So something that we talk about is, let's change the language of that a little bit, Margaret. So you have people who are facing all kinds of vulnerable situations and they're trying to survive. What I like to say is, when people are in those situations, a trafficker who wants to sell human beings to make their own profit is going to target someone. They are experts. These individuals know how to spot a vulnerability, size someone up in an instant. In climate change, we're talking about disasters, wars that erupt. Like, it's pretty easy. Someone's like, oh boy, let's go there because there's all kinds of vulnerability. We don't even have to figure it out.
Right.
Now, if someone is here in Oklahoma, and I will just speak to it briefly. A lot of outreach happens, I do this. It happens through online recruitment.
Okay.
Social media, dating apps, gaming, that kind of thing. A lot of traffickers will reach out that way. So they just know what questions.
I've not thought about that.
Yeah, that's a big one. Yeah, it's really, if everybody thinks that people are kidnapped into trafficking and they're looking over here for where trafficking is, and then someone's sitting next to them on a couch and the trafficker's talking to them on their phone. That's why we got to make sure that we know what these tactics are. But yes, so there's that. And so sometimes a trafficker has to do a little bit more work, ask a few questions to size someone up. But with these big, my heart has really been thinking about the LA wildfires, which I'm sure we're going to get into. Okay, so you have people who don't have there's now massive housing insecurity, massive food insecurity, employment insecurity. People got to provide for kids. Kids are trying to cope with what's happening. You have trauma on so many different levels. So if someone's looking for someone to take advantage of, how about a mom who's desperate to make sure her kids have food to eat? Like, hey, I can take care, I can help you. Why don't you come stay at my house? How about I buy clothes and shoes and groceries for your kid? Hey, I got work for you to do. My heart goes out to you. I'm going to help, right? Very often it is this building trust with minimal effort and minimal investment. And now saying, you owe me. And so now you have to do this. You owe me. So they flip a switch. They gain the trust softened through kindness, flip a switch. Now there's threats of violence. Now there's threats against, listen, these people will absolutely go so far as to threaten killing someone's kids, killing their pets, committing violence if this person doesn't comply.
Right. That's really scary, because what we're trying to do in real life and forging community is reach out and make those bonds stronger so that we have a place to go and we have communication networks. And what you're saying is someone might just be luring you in. So how do you recommend to people to discern between those relationships, or maybe get over the fear that they're going to be lured into something?
It's better for somebody to realize that could be a possibility. Most people don't. I would say, hopefully by going to, here's what's hard. If someone's in a vulnerable situation, I'm like, oh, go to the Red Cross. And they're like, I went to the Red Cross and they weren't able to help me yet. Or the Red Cross is great, right? But maybe they're still in a vulnerable situation. Go to a website where there's a city website that recommends organizations. Great. I don't have a car anymore. It got burnt up in the fire. So how do I get there? So there are a lot of, not just always about vulnerabilities, and it's barriers to getting real help. So that's like, I don't want to be like, oh yeah, connect yourself to a reputable organization.
Right.
Acknowledging the fact that it can be really hard. And so, but that's the best safety net. So you go to government agencies, or you go to reputable nonprofits. And you, I mean, I would imagine in LA, there are going to be places of worship that are helping people. That's better than someone on the street coming up to you and offering help.
Although, side note, maybe don't choose Scientology. We've got Lily Eve here.
That is a very good thing to note.
Speaking of LA, like just red flag there, definitely.
For sure. Okay, so that is a perfect example, though, of, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely, Lily. Yeah. So, I mean, even with places of worship, even with like nonprofits, it's still, the hard thing is someone who is in crisis. And this is the complication. This is why this is not just here's the conversation and we're going through it. No, like it's super complex. Someone who is in crisis mode, they're experiencing trauma, there's tremendous fear and uncertainty. Isn't that what is involved in climate change disasters? Fear, trauma, uncertainty, crisis. And those are all the situations that are ripe for traffickers or anyone who wants to exploit someone to go and gain control. And so, it's, man, like it's not easy. It's not easy. And so someone in that situation, at least if they are aware of the possibility that someone could exploit them, maybe it propels someone in a really hard situation to keep pressing through to try and get the more legitimate assistance.
Right.
And I mean, we're talking about the US, where people are better situated in a lot of ways than in developing nations. And it's still really difficult.
So I'm going to ask you about climate change in general, but I also want to acknowledge that people have come in and said hello and have questions. Yes. So, we had this one, which might be like a quick question. Do you know Lumosex?
I'm not familiar with it. No.
Okay.
There are a lot of great, one way that businesses are really getting involved, though. I mean, with us, even just our little organization, giving like a percentage of profits. That's really cool to like organizations fighting this. Yeah.
And Elaine says, big issue of concern with me. Too many of our youth disappear from my city here in Ontario. Yeah. I've read a whole book of 7 Fallen Feathers. Several other people on Booktube have read, which is about people getting murdered. And then we've got the whole missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls.
I'll make a note about that. I can see
that. So part of reading for Indigathon has been acquainting myself with that reality and the fact that in the US and Canada, that's especially one of the targeted populations.
Yeah. Margaret, I'm going to turn my camera off briefly. I'll be right back.
Okay. Yeah. We've got Leslie here saying hello and more talk about Scientology. So you just heard of grooming, catching up here. And in London and Toronto, they plant students in schools only there to make connections and lure students into the business.
That's what happens here too. Fishing. So planting, So sending recruiters into schools, traffickers in schools, also, homeless shelters, that kind of, like if you have like a day program or a shelter, like it's super freezing cold in Oklahoma right now, more so than usual for the winter. So people are going to go and seek safety somewhere. And yes, absolutely, recruiters for trafficking will go there because again, it's where is their vulnerability? What kind of false offers can I make in order to then gain control over someone?
Right. Absolutely. And any sort of disruption leaves more room for that, I'll say.
Right.
So
it's a good way to put it.
Let's see. Climate cacophony. Maggie is here. She's got a different answer. There's so much noise around it. Cacophony. All right. She says they know the cultural loopholes to dehumanize those who are desperate. That is another angle.
Yep, absolutely. I can speak to cultural as well.
Rachel is here. Hey, Rachel. The spider web analogy comes to mind because things are so interconnected. Yeah, definitely.
Rachel's been sprinting since like I woke up during the middle of the night.
Marathoning all week.
And yeah, and it was like 3 a.m. There's Rachel's leading sprints. I was like, what time is it? Anyway, go ahead. Sorry. But good job, Rachel.
Elaine's giving a rant about the shaded windows on vehicles, which I hate as well. So I will join you. It's illegal anyway, so I don't know why they continue to get away with it.
In Oklahoma, it's not. Yeah.
I don't know how you're supposed to be safe when you can't see the eyes of the person in the car. That just annoys me. Yeah. So she's talking about the fraud part.
That's coercion. Yeah, fraud and then coercion. Also go back. It's both, Margaret. You're right.
Okay.
Yeah. So there's often appearance of choice, but if it's one term that would be really helpful for people to Google is, coercive control.
Oh, okay.
There's a lot. You're going to probably hear more about that term, but it's like, it's not really a choice.
Why would I be hearing more about that term in the coming days, Melissa?
Well, I think that there's a linguistic movement. What are you saying, Margaret?
No, I'm just saying starting tomorrow on the inauguration. That's all I was alluding to.
Oh, fair point. Also that. Fair point, Margaret. Go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah. So
I'll speak to that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's great.
Yeah.
Yeah. They travel. So Maggie's got like a local story from her community as well, which is really horrific. It's disconcerting to see the parallels between what you're talking about and what I've experienced with some religions. Yeah.
I can speak to religious as well. Yeah.
Yeah. Maggie says the under 1,000 subs marathon just ended and we're all tired. So I'm getting the washed up dregs of the marathon. You can all come up on the beach.
Washed up dregs.
Wheeze your way through. Just listen. You don't need to type. I'll just sense your presence. Well done, everybody.
Yeah, thank you for being here when you've been working so hard.
We all have bags under our eyes, but we are fulfilled. I was up at 4
I love that.
God, Rachel. Wow. Grand prizes all around.
Yes.
Okay, so now that we've got a little crash course in more of the dangers of human trafficking and a little bit around the language and legal situation, what about climate change? You told me you had an intriguing story about how your mind clicked into the dangers of climate change as well at a young age. So
at a young age, I don't know if it's intriguing. I think it's kind of cute if I was hearing it about someone else. So I was a child I was coming of age and gaining awareness of the world there you go, Rachel. Have a lie down and listen. Absolutely. The most relaxing topic ever that you can imagine. Yes. So I was coming of age and gaining awareness of the world. I also have much older siblings that helped open my eyes to things at a younger age in like the early 90s. And people were really starting to talk about the environment was the term that was used back then. The environment, greenhouse gases, global warming, those were the terms that were used back then. And as a child, I was like, what's happening? Wait, when, why, how? Yeah. I've always been a kid that's like, there's an issue. How can I do something about it? I mean, like through my own writing, and I won't get into it, but I've traced back to earliest ages. Like my mom has told me a story when I was age 2, when I was like, everybody better do XYZ to help them take care of themselves and protect each other. But I mean, like literally as soon as I was able to talk, I was born this way. I was always going to get involved in causes. So I'm like 9 years old, and I know specifically I was in 4th grade and started gaining awareness. People were talking about recycling for the first time. People were talking about chlorofluorocarbons with like aerosols and the ozone, the hole in the ozone layer, like all of that. I'm hearing all of this on the news. And at age 9, I'm like, I got to do something about this. And then this is interesting. That summer, I did not put this together until a couple years ago. That summer, my family took a trip to Colorado from Iowa. And I saw the mountains for the first time. And I saw, oh, I'm feeling emotional just talking about it right now. I saw the mountains. It was a summer I turned 10, and I have quite a few little snapshot memories of the trees and waterfalls and driving up through the mountains and seeing the animals. And it was like that change of scenery and seeing like, oh, this is what's at stake. At age 10, I was like, it somehow, it really cemented this in me. And so then for the next year and a half, probably up until middle school, though it never really left, but in the midst of being really severely bullied, I was like, hey, can I give a presentation to this group of bullies? Which is kind of funny because I kind of take on bullies every damn day now in my life. Can I present to this room full of classroom bullies about how they can help save the earth? And I'm sure my teacher was like, okay, whatever you want, kid. And I stood up there and I gave a presentation, and they were all like really engaged with what I was saying. And I read this book, 50 Ways That Kids Can Save the Earth. That's like one of those life-changing books that had all these little things. I put together with my friend an Earth Fair where she lived on a cul-de-sac. And so we made little booths with like markers and poster board about how to save the planet and little games. And then we went around and told people to come to it. And we raised something like $40, which I'm sure was our parents giving. And, and they're like, where do you want to give it? And I was like, Greenpeace, because probably the only organization I'd heard of, but also legit, you know? Yeah. And so I was this little climate activist. It was it will always mean something to me because it was my very first cause.
Oh, climate warrior. That's great. That's great. Yeah. And when you say it's like when you were traveling from what was familiar to what was sort of an awe-inspiring vista in Colorado, that's what you were, sort of jolted into realizing, wow, there's a lot that's going to be sacrificed or changed in some way because of what we're doing.
Yeah.
Yeah, Rachel agrees. She says, why is my brain like this? I've always been fascinated by symbolism, cultural anthropology, social anthropology, and history. Yeah, you got to dig in. You got to go where you're.
Yeah, that's right.
Elaine says, I grew up in the mid 60s and 70s on a farm. Living in harmony with nature always made sense rather than take it for granted.
I can say something about that. So I grew up in Iowa, right? I was never in a rural area, but most of Iowa is rural, And I had a conversation. This was many years ago. A reporter came to my church in Des Moines, which is a mix. People at that church are a mix of beliefs, on all along the political spectrum. And he was interviewing these people about whether they would vote based on climate change. And he was interviewing an older lady in the congregation. And she was like, no, I don't really vote based on climate change. But, it's interesting. People talk about it. This would have been a more conservative person. I'm sorry, shush. And she was like, growing up on the farm, though, conservation. It was just a different word for it. And I don't know if she ever connected the two. She was like, conservation was always important. Use what you have. Don't be wasteful. Don't exploit the land. And I was like, you're saying the same thing, but okay. Yeah. So anyway, but that's similar, to what you're saying. Cobalt dragon.
Yeah. Maggie says, I remember being in college and having a massive argument about the switch from paper to recyclable plastics because I understood the chemistry and knew 100% plastic reclamation was impossible.
Interesting, Maggie.
Yeah. No more plastics, please. I learned about 7 oceans. Now we know there's just one. So what are all these massive dams doing to the natural flow of water? I'm getting a little confused because we have oceans and we have river ecologies and they're different. They relate, but they're different. But yeah, dams mess things up in a lot of ways, people and animal world. Jocelyn says they've been talking about the hole in the ozone layer for a minute now. Yeah.
And now didn't
up and then right?
Didn't the ozone hole like kind of heal itself though when we actually made some changes? We actually made changes and then it covered up. Is that right, Margaret? I remember hearing about it a few years ago. Okay.
I feel like it was almost repaired. Maybe last year people were talking about it, but the legislation for that was late 80s. So chlorofluorocarbons, and that has been
Took a
working for like
long
30
time.
years for that to
Mhm.
go back. Yeah.
Right.
Elaine says I worked in schools, elementary and secondary. Part of what I loved was running the environmental club. Yay. Yeah, and Rachel points out there's so many people that are so far down the chain, I think, of interacting with their environment from where their food comes from, that they're illiterate about not just climate change, but how it will affect them.
Yeah.
And for plastic poisons every continent. Plastic will have more mass in the ocean than fish and in our bodies. Hooray.
Yeah, right.
Jesslyn says the hydrocycle is nothing to play with. Yeah, I don't even know. I just started reading a couple books about oceans and like tideland ecosystems and how they're being affected. So
It's
I'm hoping
serious.
to read one about, it's called the Blue Machine, how the ocean works, because like never learned that. And my mom said she actually did learn about it, but it turned out to be wrong because they didn't know how it worked when she went to school. So I'm very curious about what the modern science take on it is.
Yeah.
Oh, dumping garbage in the ocean. I hear that's a thing in the UK. Ben was here a few minutes ago, and he was telling me that there's a thing in the UK about river dumping and how companies are allowed to, in certain storm situations when there's overflow because of how the system is designed, but they're doing it, they're called dry leaking or something like that. They're doing it even when there's not a storm because it's less expensive for them.
Shocking.
Externalities. Yeah. Safer form. There's the switch safer forms aerosols. Yeah. So they don't use the same chemicals.
So when we make
your hairnet,
right? But like when we actually take action, it can help things. And I feel like people also kind of don't believe that. Like it's also important to, I don't know. I mean, this is what I face every single day of my work in the midst of really, really hard things. It can be so easy to be like, oh, what's the point? But like, no, actually, we do change things. Actually, we can, even if it takes a long time. And so like, it's really important to do this series, Margaret, Truth and Reconciliation, because by finding community and talking through the hard things, it keeps our resistance up, right? It keeps us going. It keeps us taking the steps in the midst of all the hard things that we're seeing. And it's like, let's keep working for something, because also you never know when something can turn around. But if we lose hope and don't even try, then we're not helping anybody.
Right.
And that's literally what I have to coach myself with sometimes with my work.
For sure. And there's like a personal thing. So I don't know if you remember any of the 50 things that kids can do to save the earth, but I'm sure recycling was in there. And one of the things that I came across in that book, I Want a Better Catastrophe, was a really funny chapter that was called Why the Fuck Am I Recycling? Right? Because it feels like rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. And to Maggie's point, like not a big thing for personal recycling choices to make a difference. But the thing is, if we're existing in this like final stage of, if we don't really have a big impact in our choices, policy at every level in every nation, like we're toast. Like none of us are going to survive.
Literally.
Then like, what does it matter what I do? Well, you have the rest of your life to live. And if you don't want to drive yourself insane with cognitive dissonance and self-hatred, you have to make choices that you can live with. And so part of that is, well, I feel better recycling and showing that as an example to people around me, or I feel better volunteering at the farm or going out for a walk in the park rather than, downloading apps and buying stuff from China or, halfway around the world that's going to require a lot of carbon emissions.
There's something to be said as well, Margaret, about the habit. That's really interesting. I'd never thought of it until literally this moment. So let's see if I can actually verbalize it. But like the positivity of like, I have this habit with recycling. Well, what if, and this is not beyond the realm of possibility at all, what if in the next couple of years, something really helpful comes up and you're like, oh, by making this small change, we could actually do something to turn it around. I don't have any good examples. Don't get on me about the science. I don't know. It's all hypothetical. But if you already have a habit built that's how habits work, right? You can, when you pair habits, then that can make them more effective. So if you're already I'm going to do the recycling thing, maybe something more effective comes along and it far fewer mental gymnastics to be able to incorporate that into life. And I really like what you said, Margaret, as well, about modeling the behavior. When something bad is normalized, you have human trafficking, right? When it's normalized to take advantage of people, really bad things can happen. But if you can normalize something positive, that also can build and make a difference.
Well, and less on modeling, because I mean, I don't want to put people up as paragons of virtue and do virtue signaling and have that debate, because that's not what I want. But in terms of like feeling like
normalizing,
you're worth your salt, you're doing your part, you're contributing in a positive way. What I wanted to say is that you are also forging relationships. So in terms of accentuating the positive instead of normalizing the negative.
That's good.
Maybe when you recycle or when you volunteer or when you walk, like you say hello to your neighbors because you're feeling in a better mood. You know, you're not like spiraling, doom scrolling. You're forging relationships, and that community bonds. Those community bonds are what is going to help us help each other.
I mean, more and more, I feel like every week I like see something about how community and relationships and having a safety net. This goes back with the dual topics we're talking about. A safety net is the thing that can totally prevent someone from getting into a much harder situation, or the lack of a safety net exacerbates everything negative. So, and that's for any situation. So I love that. I love that connection, Margaret.
Yeah, and Maggie's talking about how it's a vicious cycle, like kind of to what you were saying about normalizing negativity. Yeah. Kat Paw talked about something I've never heard of, the 100th monkey effect, working towards a tipping point where everyone starts doing it and it's not that big a percentage, which tell me more. I like that.
But then you get to like a tipping point and then all of a sudden it does make a difference.
Right.
I'm guessing.
Right.
That's what the 100th.
What's coming to mind with that is like the high school setting with like one person doing it isn't cool and two person isn't doing it isn't cool. But then you get three and you're like, oh, what are they up to over there? And you're like peer pressure.
Like the bell curve, like you got your early adopters with like, I don't know, iPods. And then people are like, oh boy, I remember hearing about the iPhone for the first time. And I was like, okay, I don't need that technology. Yeah. Here I am, so that's true. And that becomes normalized. So yeah, interesting.
So Maggie mentioning recycling fraud. True. But here's the thing, just like what Melissa was saying about knowing that fraud exists. Forewarned is forearmed. Like we want people to be knowing about these dangers so that they can make legitimate choices, like whether they're going to different organizations for aid or whether they're trying to, make a positive difference by recycling. Similar.
Good point.
Yeah. Oh, I'm talking about composting. 30 years ago, people were laughing at me. I didn't care. It meant every spring I had wheelbarrows full of rich earth to add to my yard. Now we have a green bin program, which is awesome.
Wow.
Yeah. And then more about plastics. Either we need a recycling mandate or stopping the production of plastics, or both. Because I think we're in the what's that dystopian movie, Blade Runner era, where like we do need to go through all of the landfill and start like harvesting this stuff and reusing it at this point instead of making more. But no one's going to follow me there, so that's fine. Okay, so let's see. I had other questions. Let's see. What do you see as your fields? Oh, no, here's the framing we haven't even gotten to yet. So when I was reading the documents you sent over, when I think about human trafficking, like I'm fed images by the media, like kidnapping and cops and stuff. You're like, that is such a low percentage, not what happens.
Right.
But what the documents point out is that there's sort of three areas where you can try to combat it. There is, and I wrote it down. Let me see if I can find it. Prevention, which we've been talking about in terms of vulnerabilities, prosecution in terms of justice, and recovery in what you're talking about, victim services, which is what Dragonfly does in Oklahoma. So did you have any other comments on the other portions that we didn't talk about so much since we're getting close to the hour for prosecution and recovery?
Okay, I have a few things that I want to say. Margaret, can I
Yeah.
just go and go through things because I got
Yeah.
notes written down? Okay, so that is often referred to as the 3 Ps or the 4 Ps in the US. Um, Prevention, protection, prosecution, and then Hillary Rodham Clinton added partnerships to that a few years
Okay.
ago. Prevention, we all understand. Protection, that's like what Dragonfly does, that falls into survivor services, helping people recover and build a new life, which also breaks a cycle of trafficking in future generations, and then also prevents someone from being re-exploited. So it's protection and prevention go hand in hand. Prosecution, that is a topic, that's a complex topic in and of itself. Boy, all I can say is that it's progressive. It's still really hard to get trafficking convictions because of the burdens of proof. This goes into legalese. And so I will say there's more to be done, but we are definitely not where were when I started with all of this 12 years ago. It's better. We work with law enforcement, we work with prosecutors, we work with attorneys. I mean, all the time. I am the co-chair of the Policy and Data Committee for the Oklahoma Coalition Against Trafficking because I am a lawyer. And so we're working on legislation every single year. You know, it's not fast, but it's better than it was. And then partnerships is just this idea that we talked about. No one organization can do anything. And so when we get back to the vulnerable situations that people face due to maybe climate change, disasters, wars that arise, housing, so the housing insecurity, food insecurity, all of these vulnerable situations. Let's also talk about how discrimination against people who identify as LGBTQIA+, that is a population that gets disproportionately targeted by traffickers. People with disabilities, people who have physical disabilities, people who have Down syndrome, people who have autism, people who need walking aids, hearing aids, sight aids. This is a population that does not get represented when people are learning about trafficking, and they are disproportionately targeted by traffickers for sex trafficking and labor trafficking. People of color, Maggie mentioned here in Oklahoma, we say MMIP, but MMIW, MMIWG, missing and murdered Indigenous people, women, girls. The Native population, in Oklahoma is one of the highest Native populations in the country. And so just like, especially women and girls are disproportionately targeted for all kinds of violent crimes. Trafficking is also, they're disproportionately targeted for that, as well as Black people, people of color, where there is discrimination that creates a situation as well that traffickers can take advantage of. But in the media, we're seeing 11-year-old white girls. And there's this like classic, iconic image of, you see this white girl and it's black and white, and there's this man's hand over her mouth. Google human trafficking images, you'll see it. That was all the rage. It was on billboards for years. And you're like, well, okay. If we're, again, the reason we have to know the myths and misconceptions and the truth is because if we're looking in this one box of what trafficking looks like and we're missing all of this, anyone who falls into these areas isn't getting help, and the prevention isn't happening there. Let's see here. I'm trying to go fast. If you have heard that trafficking, thank you. What was Cobalt Dragon's real name?
Elaine,
thank you. Although Cobalt Dragon's a very cool name.
Awesome. Yeah.
So let's talk about some of those misconceptions. First of all, if you have heard that trafficking exists in your area because people are using the highways to bring it in from somewhere else, here's the truth. Every state has highway system, and we have to face what's actually, like, traffickers use the highway the same way I use the highway every day. And yes, there are like tracks that people will use to kind of transport people around. Absolutely. But the issue is that where you live, if there is trafficking, your neighbors, people in your government, leaders in the community, your everyday person that you pass by at the coffee shop, at the pharmacy, at the grocery store, people around you demand illicit sex and free or cheap labor. And they are willing to pay for human beings. So the demand exists. And that is the hardest pill to swallow. So you're like, well, the demand exists here, so it's happening closer than I think. And then there are people in your community willing to sell and exploit people in your community to people in your community. And that, I think, is the hardest thing. There's a lot of talk about trafficking due to the border situation and illegal immigration. My concern with that is if people are immigrating here, legally or illegally, they're going to be very vulnerable to people taking advantage of them. But if there was no immigration allowed, trafficking would still take place in the United States because they're just going to find somebody else that they can exploit in these vulnerable situations. So we have to be honest with ourselves as to why this is happening. Margaret, I'm going as fast as I can.
No. I'm just gonna pop in and say one example is that I just read Climate Migrants Within the U.S. book. It was about tidelands that are disappearing in Louisiana, in Rhode Island, in the Bay Area, in places that have been burned out in California, for example, in Florida. And those low-income housing developments that were built in the floodplain that aren't going to be rebuilt, those people have fewer choices about where to go. They will depend on someone else, and they're going to be in exactly that same situation, vulnerable to predation.
It's exactly it. That's it. That's it right there. Perfect example. Be really careful when you're looking for information about human trafficking online. It's really hard to come by good, solid statistics about this because it is super underground. It is still misunderstood. Prosecutions aren't happening. And very often people who are trafficked are either misidentified as experiencing domestic violence or sexual assault. And people, if they're not educated in the red flags of trafficking, they're not going to assess for that. So they're going to think that they're not going to even think that that's a trafficking situation, or people are seen as criminals. They are being trafficked. They are being controlled. They are given a script to say if they get arrested, and it's the victims of this crime that are taking the fall for the people exploiting them. Right. And there's often a lot of fear involved or a lot of loyalty. We're talking like Stockholm syndrome sometimes, all kinds of complexities that make it so that people are viewed as criminals, especially if they're people of color. And so they're not being reported as as victims of the crime of trafficking. They're being reported as criminals. There's also a lot of forced criminality involved in trafficking, people being forced to commit crimes for the person controlling them. They take the fall for that. Oh, Margaret. Okay. I think that I have at least roughly addressed everything as fast as I could. Thank you for letting me just talk.
Yeah. Dragonfly is equally awesome. We dragons need to connect and keep making a difference. Yeah.
I love it.
Maggie says climate migrants are the same economic levels as the migration groups of the Dust Bowl years. Yeah. So a lot of shit happened then. I mean, I could write a novel about that maybe in the future.
Yeah. Margaret, come visit Oklahoma when you're going to write a book about it.
Yeah. That would never happen here. Where have you buried your own head? Sorry, I get pissy with hypocritical stuff.
Rachel, relatable every single day. 100%. I could talk for another hour just about this message. I won't, but I could.
There's a great quote, and I forget which. It was a recent nonfiction book, and it was basically like, "What do I spend my time on? I don't spend my time on the people who have." It wasn't buried their head, but it was like some metaphor about like drowned your brain in something. Like they're hiding from themselves, basically. Why would I spend my time on them?
Right. Good point.
Yeah.
Except I will say the places where I've gone to speak about this situation are, I'm like, if anybody invites me, no matter how we might differ in personal views or whatever you think about, if you don't believe anything I'm saying, I'm at least going to go and talk about this because you never know how it could flip a switch in someone's brain. But it is hard for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. Agree. And I've had a poll out before and during, and it was just, what do we call the climate thing that's happening right now? And I gave some choices. We had 9 votes, and it looks like 40% vote for climate crisis, and then catastrophe, and then at the end, change and emergency. So I like that we've amped the urgency of the word. That makes sense to me.
Good. Yep. That's good.
Yeah. And if you're watching this on the replay, I've got a question for you in the final banner here. What is your most painful realization about the climate catastrophe? I guess what people would want to say. Catastrophe. And, put it in the comments. And maybe if you want to come and talk about your, emotional galvanizing issue like Melissa has today, feel free to contact me. Because I've got slots open. I'm doing this once a month all year, and hopefully it'll help us get to know more about how it affects all our lives in many different ways. And I really appreciate Melissa being the first one.
I was the first one for your August thing too.
Oh yeah, the wind downs or the
your August, your writer wind down in August.
Yeah, the wind downs. Yeah. Good
when
stuff.
It comes to Margaret, I'm an early adopter, I guess.
I love it. I love it.
Thank you so much for having me on, Margaret. This is the first time in all these years that I have had a conversation about this topic specifically. And then just watching what happened in LA over the last couple of weeks, it kept bringing this to mind that I was going to talk to you about it. Super highly relevant. So thank you for letting me come on and talk about a pretty niche issue with climate change. But then, like Rachel was saying, you just see how it's all connected. And just thank you for being you. Listen to these words of affirmation I'm going to give you, and you just take it. Thank you for being you, and for being very consistently committed to and following through with the things that you believe in personally. And you are dedicated to opening up people's eyes to new things, getting people on board with things, helping people learn perspectives that might be different from their own. You put your money where your mouth is, Margaret. And that means a lot. It means a lot. So thank you, and keep going, because it's important work that you're doing. Okay, I'm done.
Thank you. I think I would have gotten along with 9-year-old Melissa too. I think you would have punched me straight up to another level of understanding, but I'm glad I've met you later in life, Melissa.
Absolutely. Better late than never. That's for sure.
Yes. Yes. And if I'm ever in Oklahoma, I will drive. It's a big state to drive through, but I will drive to where you are.
Halfway. I'll meet you halfway. Don't you worry about that.
Well, thank you everyone for watching. Definitely subscribe to Melissa's channels. Join up for the sprints, for whatever you have to do. This, community bonding and forging links is going to be necessary for our survival.
Yeah.
So good luck, everyone. Happy reading. Take care of yourselves, and we'll see you again soon.
Bye.